Hello everyone and welcome into yet another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for joining me on this wonderful Wednesday afternoon for another great show. As always, for today's show, we start off talking some Thursday Night Football. Very big NFC East matchup tomorrow night between the Commanders and Eagles, so I got you covered in all things betting, from over-unders, money line spreads to some player props for you. And then I'm going to conclude my positional rankings for Week 11 of the NFL season with my tight ends and my defenses. And then, last but not least, as always, I present to you my weekly Shadow Report, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups I believe will define the week in fantasy football. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you that if one of you contests this or just follow the shows and networks on the podcast and sports networks here at GSMC, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the shows and networks as well to keep more up to date. But if you want to contribute to our shows more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact. You can do one of two things, actually one of three things. Go to our website to leave a tip or donation at gsmcpodcast.net, or leave it just here on YouTube by clicking the $ in the chat box by the comments section, or you can just leave any comments, questions, or concerns you may have throughout the show in my comments section. They will show up on my screen, and I will read them on air. Great way to get your opinions out there. We love hearing them. They just make this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into tomorrow night's big game between the Commanders and Eagles. Huge NFC East showdown that could determine who is basically the number 2 seed in the NFC this season, because no one's catching the Lions. But this game is very important in terms of the outcome of the NFC East. And that team who wins tomorrow night is most likely to be the favorite for the number 2 seed. Despite, all the rumblings about how San Fran might get back into the picture, the NFC North is just so crowded and things of that nature. This is firmly for the NFC East title race advantage, and also that number 2 seed and home field advantage, most importantly. So, tomorrow night's game has perhaps the hugest stakes of any Thursday night football game, potentially in history. Usually we get a lot of duds on Thursday night football, but this is actually the biggest game I think I can remember in recent memory that takes place on a Thursday night. And so looking at it from this perspective, it really is one of those games where you have to tread lightly, but also might want to throw your hat in the ring in terms of a betting perspective, because it is one of those games you can get caught up in the excitement, the hype surrounding it, and you definitely want to be wary of the betting market for a game like this. So, in terms of a general betting perspective, here's how it looks. Philly is a 3.5-point favorite at home. The over-under is 49.5. Not necessarily the highest over-under for a game of this magnitude, but certainly kind of in that range that you should be able to like if you are a frequent bettor. In terms of money lines, Philly minus 170 to win, Washington plus 145. So as you can see, Philly, slight advantage here. They are the home team in this one, but the stakes are high, and so that could even things out. We saw last week when the Commanders had their first real test in facing the Pittsburgh Steelers. I believe that game was on the road, but don't quote me on that. We saw that they are so competitive even in that loss. So we know the Commanders won't be overawed at the occasion of this game. And we know that Jaden Daniels won't be overawed either. This kid has played efficient football, even played through a rib injury in that exciting, heart-rending game against Chicago a couple weeks ago. So we know what he's made of. So he's not going to go into Philly and be unafraid, even though yesterday I did suggest that he may not live up to quote-unquote loftier standards, so to speak. In terms of what I think Jaden Daniels is good at doing. He's good at being efficient, and that doesn't necessarily mean being flashy. This is not an indictment of who he is as a player. It's who he is in this Washington Commanders system that I think is the reason why people might sometimes be frustrated by his lack of gaudy numbers and quote-unquote stat padding, so to speak. So do not necessarily look for Jaden Daniels to be a world beater in terms of passing yards. We'll talk about this in our prop bet segment coming up next a little bit more. But what he's going to do is going to retain the football, move the chains, and do it in a way that can keep his team in the game. Because I think the game is definitely going to be won and lost when Philly's offense takes the field against that Washington defense, because that's the most uneven, in my opinion, matchup out of all the units on the field. The Philly offense certainly has an advantage in terms of talent. They don't have the advantage in terms of play calling. All the production that we're seeing from the Philly offense kind of stems from their improvisational abilities. I feel like Nick Sirianni in some ways is holding them back in terms of, sometimes letting Saquon run too much or not necessarily taking as many deep shots as fans might want with that vertical talent you have with both A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. But one thing is lacking is definitely the usage of Dallas Goedert is kind of a shocking storyline here for me, because I really think Dallas Goedert is the X factor into how seriously I will be taking Philly as a Super Bowl contender come playoff time, because we know what their weapons are capable of. A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, we know. But we don't necessarily know if Dallas Goedert can be the kind of skeleton key to unlock everything when they're in a pressure cooker situation come playoff time. And this could be the perfect litmus test for that. This is a pressurized game. Yes, they're at home, but they need to show me something more than individuality here. There needs to be a cohesive plan, because as much as Nick Sirianni is getting away with it by having the Eagles be such a solid team through these individualistic players, I still think come playoff time, they're going to need to start planning to see certain things, because everything changes in the playoffs. And so this game will test that. But then we look at the Commanders' defense, and then we say, okay, perhaps this isn't necessarily the best caliber of defense on a playoff team or a presumptive playoff team in the NFL right now, because it's certainly been showing signs of improvement. They acquired Marshawn Lattimore before the trade deadline, and it's a nice pickup. Bobby Wagner's throwing it back to 2013 when he was in Seattle, and they have a lot of nice talent. But this is still a defense I can't wholly trust in games of this magnitude. They have some mental lapses, some miscues where you can take advantage of them, and we saw it against Pittsburgh, Russell on that play to win the game, to that deep fade to Mike Williams. I feel like that's one of those situations where the Eagles are looking at it and can say, okay, maybe the vertical passing game can work a little bit better against this defense than others. And so that's what they're wanting to exploit. But I don't necessarily think if the Eagles do put up a lot of points, it will indicate future success come playoff time, because you're going to be facing a lot of tough defenses. The Vikings most likely will be there. The Lions too. The 49ers, they'll be very tough come playoff time should they get in. The Cardinals and Rams, sneaky teams in the NFC West that if they sneak into the playoffs can really hurt you on the offensive side of the football. And maybe, if Seattle, this is wishful thinking, But the point being, there are a lot of tough defenses in the NFC. And so the Philadelphia Eagles have to take care of business against the defenses that are going to be in the playoff picture, instead of, dominating these inferior teams who can't keep up with their offense. Because chances are, if Philly goes into the playoffs And they're relying on individuality for Saquon Barkley to get X amount of touches, for A.J. Brown to get X amount of receptions, for Devontae Smith to contribute X amount of times, for Jalen Hurts to improvise X amount of times. It's not going to go according to plan because they have no plan. And so I need to see Nick Sirianni step up in terms of taking accountability for this offense whenever things go awry. But then on the Commanders side of things, this game is more about seeing where you're at, because I still don't necessarily view them as a true contender. I view them as a very solid playoff caliber team. But this game, and I feel more so than the Pittsburgh game, because it certainly felt like that Pittsburgh game was a little bit iffy in certain moments for them. And that loss, because of that one big play from Russ, was indicative of that kind of miscue nature to their play in some moments. And this game, I feel like, is a better test because Philly isn't necessarily as well-rounded right now than Pittsburgh, if we're looking at it this way, and they're certainly less well-coached than Pittsburgh. So, for the Commanders, take advantage of moments where Philly might let down their guard, especially on the defensive side of the football. Because if you can create and generate takeaways against this Philly offense, you're as good as gold. Because I don't necessarily trust that Philly defense that much, and you gotta trust that Jaden Daniels is unflappable at this point. Even in games where he loses, he still looks efficient, and he can still operate this offense at a high level, and until he proves otherwise, then the Commanders will be in this game. But that being said, just because of that home field advantage, and just because I feel, Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley have been doing this all season, I still have to take the Eagles. It's no slight to the Commanders. It should be a fascinating game to watch, but I still have to take the Philadelphia Eagles in this one to not necessarily take command of the NFC East just yet, but to stick their head above Washington at this point in the season. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments below. We'll be talking about it a little bit more right after we come back from the break in terms of a prop betting perspective. A lot of interesting players to analyze there. We'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.